Most CPUs or central processing units can be purchased in a retail pack as shown. The advantage of this is it will be supplied with a suitable heatsink and fan. This is the CPU in its anti-static packing, and as with all these electronic components, they should be left in their packing until they are ready to be installed. This is the bottom of the CPU, and we can see what appears to be missing pins. This is for alignment purposes. Notice here a mark, also known as a legend, on the bottom right hand side. If we turn the CPU the right way up, we can see the legend on the bottom left hand side. The CPU is a very fast switching device and creates a high degree of heat, and if this heat is not kept within certain limits, the CPU will burn out. In fact, if you were to run a CPU without a heatsink and fan, it would in most cases burn out very quickly. Let's take a closer look at the heatsink and fan. The heatsink is normally made from aluminium fins. On the top sits the fan that forces the air through the aluminium fins. This is the electrical connection that plugs into the motherboard to power the fan. Also on the heatsink and fan you will find a locking system and is locked using this arm. Before leaving the heatsink and fan, there have been many discussions on which way the fan should blow, onto the heatsink or away from it. This depends upon the manufacturer of the device, but the two basic principles are shown in the next examples. As the heatsink and fan sits on the CPU as shown, as the CPU starts to generate heat, it is passed to the primary heatsink, and is physically part of the secondary heatsink that normally consists of aluminium fins. When the fan starts, it draws in cooler air across the fins, expelling warm air and thus cooling down the aluminium fins, the primary heatsink and the CPU. Alternatively, the heatsink and fan sits on the CPU as before. Heat passes to the aluminium fin and air is drawn downwards across the fins, thus cooling down the heatsink and CPU. If in any doubt of which type of heatsink and fan you should be using, consult the manufacturer of the CPU. Now let's check the ZIF or zero insertion socket on the motherboard. Around the ZIF socket there is a piece of plastic known as the retaining mechanism, and it has two lugs. Here is an arm that locks the ZIF socket. To unlock the ZIF socket you must lift the arm. Notice that the arm is trapped under an extra piece of plastic that acts as a locking device. So to lift the arm you must first gently move the arm from under this locking device and then it can be raised. Notice how the whole ZIF socket moves as you raise the arm. If you inspect the side of the ZIF socket you will find in one corner a mark, and in most cases this will represent pin 1. The legend of the CPU must be aligned with this pin. We should be able to drop the CPU into the socket without using any force, hence the name, zero insertion force socket. If you find you have to exert any pressure, check that you have aligned the legend with pin 1, or it could be that the CPU pins are bent. If they are bent, you can straighten them by using some long nose pliers. Remember to wear an anti-static wrist strap. If you have to bend them back into shape, take it slow as they will break off, and if this happens, it will render the CPU useless. Once into position, gently place some pressure on the top of the CPU and lower the arm downwards as shown. Lock the arm under the locking device of the ZIF socket. This will cause the ZIF socket to grip the pins of the CPU. The heatsink and fan will now need installing. If we turn over the heatsink and fan, you will find it smeared with silicone grease. In some cases this will be supplied in a small tube and it would then have to be applied to the CPU. Although the surface of the CPU may look smooth, under a magnifying glass the surface is uneven and the silicone is used to increase the contact with the heatsink. If you find, as in this case, the silicone has already been applied, do not under any circumstances touch it, since removing it will reduce the heat transfer of the CPU to the heatsink, which ultimately can cause the CPU to overheat, causing it to develop a fault or reducing its life. You will find that most heatsink and fans are positioned either way around over the retaining mechanism. The correct way around is finding out the location on the motherboard where the power for the fan is, then position the power connector to this side. Lock one part of the heatsink over one of the lugs as shown. Then allow the heatsink and fan to rest over the CPU. Once this is done, check that the locking lever on the heatsink and fan is in the unlocked position. Once this is done, push the other end of the heatsink over the lug as shown. Now use the arm to lock the heatsink and fan into position. Once the heatsink and fan is in position, you can connect the power connector to the motherboard. Notice the shape of the fan connector. It can only be plugged in one way. Next we shall fit the RAM. This will be plugged into one of the DIMM or dual inline memory module slots. This is a single stick of RAM. Once again, avoid touching the metal contacts. Some motherboards will only allow you to use one slot before you can use the other. In most cases, this will be numbered. On this motherboard, it is labelled as A1 and B1, so we shall use A1 first. On closer inspection of the DIMM slots, you will find a break, which is off centre. Also at the ends of the DIMM slots, you will find two retaining clips. Now if we check the RAM or Random Access Memory module, we shall find a notch that will be aligned with the break in the slot. Also at the end of the RAM, there will be other notches that the retaining clips of the DIMM slots will lock into. Pull back the two retaining clips found on the DIMM slot. Now check the alignment of the break in the DIMM slot with that of the RAM notch. Remember that DDR memory can be found in different formats, so if you're having problems aligning the break in the DIMM slot with the notch in the RAM, recheck that you have the correct type. Once aligned, apply even pressure to the top of the module. Done correctly, you will find that the end retaining clips will lock the RAM in position. Notice how the RAM sits in the DIMM slot and how each retaining clip has gripped it. That's as much as we can do with the motherboard. Now it needs installing into the case. Almost all motherboards come with the rear blanking plate. Here we can see how the keyboard and the mouse etc. are aligned with it. This is because not all motherboards have the same number of devices on the back. Some have more USB ports, for instance, or may be equipped with a high-definition video output. You may find an existing blanking plate in the case, and if you do, it will need removing. Push the new plate into position, and in most cases this will need a little pressure to lock it into position. Make sure the plate is the correct way up. In our example, the keyboard and mouse is on the left-hand side. The motherboard is held in position by some types of supports. In this example, the case was supplied with some brass supports, but these supports can be found in many different material and shapes. If we look into the case, we can see a number of screw holes where the brass supports will screw into. Now let's return to the motherboard. We can see here we have a number of fixing holes. These holes need to be aligned with the screw holes found in the case. For each fixing hole found in the motherboard, you should screw in a brass support. Bear in mind that these brass supports are made from metal, and if you misposition one, it can short out the motherboard. That can lead to damaging the motherboard and also the power supply. Carefully place the motherboard in the computer case, checking the alignment of the fixing hole and the brass supports. The motherboard is then secured into position. Earlier we discovered that the case is supplied with a 24-pin power plug. Before continuing, notice how the plug is split into two parts. So if the motherboard you are using only requires a 20-pin, then the plug is split and the 4-pin plug is not used. Notice that the motherboard power socket has a lip and the plug has a clip. When you push the plug into the position, the clip will lock over the lip. If you're using excessive pressure, check alignment. Bear in mind that if you need to unplug the power plug, you will need to apply pressure to the clip before plugging away from the motherboard socket. This is the CPU power socket. Locate a 4-pin 12-volt power plug and push this into the socket. Once again, this will need to be aligned, and it also has a locking clip. Some cases have extra cooling fans, and if this is the case, connect this to one of the power connectors. Next, you will need to connect the front panel power switch. First, identify which of the leads it will be that runs from the front of the case. This will normally consist of 2 wires. In our example, it is orange and white. Now locate the front panel connector on the motherboard. Once again, refer to the manufacturer's manual. If we remember, it is the connector that all the switches and LEDs from the front panel will be connected to. 2 of the pins will be marked as power SW or power switch, or in our example here it is marked as WRBTN. Notice that the orange wire is on the left hand side. If the case is supplied with a speaker, this should be connected next. In our example, it has a red and black wire. Locate the speaker connector on the motherboard. Once again, check with the manual. When this is plugged in, the red wire is also on the left. If you're using a separate video adapter, then this should be plugged into a PCI or PCIe slot now. If the power supply has a main switch, make sure that it is in the off position. Connect a power cable and a monitor to the 15-pin video adapter. Check that no cables are restricting the movement of the fans. Very gently spin the fan to make sure that it can spin freely. Turn on the main switch on the back of the computer if applicable. Some motherboards will power up immediately. In our example, we need to push the front power button. Keep an eye on the fan. If it fails to spin, turn off the computer. Then recheck the connections. In most cases, you should hear a single bleep, followed by a number of messages displayed on the screen.